Madam President, delegates and delegates, I bring greetings from President Rafael Correa and an embrace from the people of Ecuador for all our sister nations of our United Nations. This last decade of the citizen revolution in Ecuador has shown us that if we are to achieve development, we must do everything opposite to the prescription that has been given us by the neoliberal hegemony in the past few years. In this last decade of building our country and the sovereignty of our social contract, we have been able to recover faith and hope in a country that had been destroyed. We have discovered that this hope can be reflected in tangible results for our peoples through the reduction of poverty, of inequality, through the redistribution of economic growth, and by generating employment with unprecedented access to public services through the guarantee of rights, through education and free health. We have recovered a demoralized country which, after going through 7 presidents in 10 years, a banking crisis created by our elites who expelled hundreds of thousands of migrants from our country, with a loss in sovereignty, with foreign military bases in our territory, opted for founding a vibrant democracy, a sovereign republic in the global system. And to achieve this, we had to break with the paradigms of the neoliberal ideological fundamentalism. And we also had power is not only military and financial, it is more importantly dominion over ideas. Power is hegemony because of the capacity to generate consensus, common meaning, and to explain our history and our environment. And to do so, the powers of hegemony have appropriated words that we all use, and they have given them meaning to impose a political and moral agenda on the planet. And it's for this reason that from the South, from the periphery, we must challenge the meaning of the major concepts that are often bandied about in this General Assembly. We must, for example, challenge the concept of development. And if we're all to follow the same prescription, and to ensure that we're all following the same prescription, they have tried to convince us that development is a technical issue when it is primarily a political issue. In Latin America, the most unequal region of the world, there can be no genuine development, sustainable development, through social cohesion and political stability without redistribution. And this redistribution oftentimes means that we have to clash with the elites who have historically refused and continue to refuse to relinquish any iota of their political power. It is no coincidence that Latin America, I insist this is the most unequal region of the world, has, for example, an average tax rate of 20% of GDP when industrialized countries have rates of 30, 40, or 50% of GDP. And that average is 38% for the European Union countries. However, any rise in the tax rate to ensure that Latin American countries can deliver rights or redistribute wealth or stimulate the economy is resisted by our elites, who mobilize all the resources within their reach through the private media, which is the most powerful tool to maintain the status quo and to destabilize governments that dare to challenge their interests. To achieve development, we have to break with the primary export model of accumulating capital. We must diversify our economies. We must change our productive apparatus, and we must depart from an excessive dependence on commodities. This income-based approach, which often is based on cheap, uncertain labor and on the bounty of nature more than on the innovative capacity of our people, makes our elites also oppose deep productive transformations to achieve development. In fact, the countries that achieved development in the 19th century as well as in the 20th century in North America and Europe, and more recently in East Asia, applied aggressive protection measures for their nascent industries through an active role, regulations, and planning by the state with no regard for intellectual property. But now, here's the irony: when those same countries have achieved their development, that is to say, as soon as they achieved a position of dominance with respect to productivity and competitiveness of their new industries, they joined the narrative of development that I just mentioned. Friends of the Global South, if we are to diversify our economies, change our productive matrices, let's do what they did and not what they are telling us we must do. First and foremost, development is a political issue. One good example of that is the problem of tax evasion and tax havens. It is estimated that in the case of Ecuador, amounts equivalent to 30% of our GDP, that is to say, a third of our economy, are hidden. That is the word that we have to use in tax havens. Imagine the economic progress that could have been made, how much poverty could have been reduced, how we could have reduced inequality if this money had been invested in our country and if taxes had been paid. We are now dealing with reconstructing the affected zones that suffered a terrible earthquake that affected our country last April. ECLAC calculates that the cost of reconstruction will be $3.5 billion, which means we have to make huge efforts and sacrifices for our country. But there you have it. We have $30 billion hidden in tax havens. But to put an end to these tax havens, to have critical resources for our development, we have to wage a political battle. It's good that some countries are committed to development cooperation, but there still isn't one iota of assistance in an ocean of injustices, including financial, banking, and tax practices that undermine our right to development by some of the same states that are seeking to compensate with absolutely negligible cooperation compared with the phenomenon of capital flight caused by their banking secrecies and their low tax rates. Madam President, distinguished delegates, Ecuador reiterates its call to create an intergovernmental body within the United Nations for tax justice, a democratic institutional structure that is binding and puts an end to this shameful practice in the 21st century, tax havens. Ecuador took the revolutionary decision to conduct a referendum in February 2017 to consult with our people whether they would agree with prohibiting all public servants, including those who were popularly elected, from holding capital and assets in tax havens. We are pleased that with our ethical pact, covenant to the world, we're hoping that this would be an example of one way of fighting against global plutocracy, speculative capitalism, and faceless capital. There's another idea that we often hear with political for political purposes, that is human rights. Almost all our political action in our citizens' revolution was thought out from the perspective of human rights. Our constitution is one of the most advanced constitutions in the world in terms of guaranteeing human rights, and it is the first one in guaranteeing the rights to nature. Our constitution sees human rights as integrated and multidimensional, which means that importance is given to all rights, of course, civil and political rights, but also economic and social rights. We believe that you cannot speak of guaranteeing human rights, especially in the Latin American context, without reducing poverty and inequalities. And it's for this reason that we are one of the countries that has done the most to reduce poverty throughout the world, with a historic reduction of extreme poverty through income of more than 70% in 2007, going to 8.5% in 2015. So Ecuador is one of the countries of the world, and here again, this is a point of pride for us, that has done the most to reduce inequality, that huge scourge in Latin America. 6 points between 2007 and 2013. That also is how we respect human rights. So Ecuador continues to push for peace. We do not have weapons of mass destruction. We are not at war with any country, nor are we bombing anyone else. So let us allow for the immediate entry into force of the CTBT. It's also important that we leave behind that vision that sees the state as the sole violator of human rights. Of course, states can violate human rights, but other actors can do so, especially transnational corporations. In Ecuador, we have experienced this, where we saw the Chevron Texaco Oil Company contaminate our rivers, our forests, our Amazonia region, causing disease and death for our people and doing great damage to the Amazon jungle. The Chevron Texaco oil spill was 85 times bigger than the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, and 18 times bigger than the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska in 1989. The difference is that this was not an accidental oil spill, but rather this was a bid to make oil at a cheaper cost. Ecuador is not the only country to have suffered such abuse. Transnational corporations cannot continue to operate without sufficient checks and balances to limit, regulate, and supervise their activity with a view to the general interest of most of the peoples inhabiting this planet. We reiterate our plea for the adoption of a legally binding international instrument that will be binding on transnational corporations and deliver human rights. We are grateful for the trust expressed by states in Ecuador by appointing us to chair the intergovernmental working group to draft that treaty. At the 21st International Conference on Climate Change, which took place in Paris, my country proposed the creation of an international environmental justice court to punish crimes against nature and to establish obligations in terms of ecological debt and the consumption of environmental goods. We live in a world where there are courts to punish countries when they allegedly endanger or imperil the investments of major multinational corporations, but there are no courts to punish those who unscrupulously degrade our environment. This paradox is so decisive and telling of the world in which we live, where the supremacy is that of capital over human beings. We claim the supremacy of human beings over capital. Ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely essential that after decades of discussion, we push for the democratization of the United Nations. And more specifically, we must once again strike a balance and to recalibrate the weight of the General Assembly vis-a-vis the Security Council. With respect to this, we must change the composition, working methods, and attributions. The use of the veto, which is the exclusive privilege of the conquering nations coming out of the Second World War, which concentrate or account for 70% of global trade in weapons, does not ensure the supreme objective of preserving international peace and security. We must set a deadline to conclude negotiations geared towards reforming the United Nations. We must also reverse the loss of weight in the multilateral system in global governance. Here, we wish to say that we must reflect on how we can correct the parallel institutional framework where there are exclusive clubs and reduced groups of countries that carry clout in terms of decisions affecting everyone. From the G77, which Ecuador will have the honor of presiding next year, we call for more democracy, more equality between states, and let's leave behind the global order that was bequeathed to us by the decolonization process of the second half of the 20th century. And let's do away with states of first, second, and third class categories. Madam President, our liberator Simon Bolivar, who said that the unity of our peoples is not simply the wish of men, but it is the inexorable decree of destiny, would be proud to see us taking firm steps towards the unity of peoples in the South. And he would celebrate the leading role being played by Ecuador to fight for the emancipation of our peoples. We have made great progress over the past years to strengthen sovereignty of our country in the global system, but there still remains a great deal to be done. Unfortunately, our Americas continue to be the victim of fly-by-night interference and reactionary action from within to imperil democratization of our societies. We still have a lot to do to ensure that our elites learn to recognize the commonwealth and the votes of millions of persons and to respect that, whether they like it or not. Let us stop playing with democracy and the sacred mandate handed to us by our peoples. Friends, it would be remiss of me if I closed without recognizing our people, supported by the leadership of President Correa, for everything he has done to bring about full development, justice, and equity. 10 years on from the Citizens' Revolution, we have replaced discouragement with hope, and we have shown to humankind that political action can build a world where the human being is not a mere tool of the accumulation of capital, but rather the very aim of government action. Dear friends, we await you in Quito in October, when we will be able to host all of you at the Habitat 3 conference and show you our great hospitality. See you then. Thank you.
I